Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Ramey Johnson, and I'd like to welcome and thank you for joining me for part 2 of the first ever Marijuana Summit held in Lakewood. This summit is being recorded, and frankly, yesterday the response was overwhelming. It was a huge hit. We will have a link in my next newsletter. Please, if you will, send me your contact information and I will get you on the distribution list. What we have found with some of the with all of the presenters, is that the information that you are receiving is profound. And it would be nice if this kind of thing would be actually shown in our school district. There has never been a forum that was designed just for the education on the topic of marijuana and on its real impacts, socially, economically, criminally, or health-wise. But before I go any farther, I would like to thank my friend, Diane Duffy, who is managing the Zoom platform. She has reached out to the speakers, you bet, wave, to make sure that they were all on top of this and that their slides will be shown the way that they wanted them. Diane, I couldn't have done this without you. Thank you. Although legalizing retail sales of recreational marijuana was voted down by the voters in Lakewood 6 years ago, it is once again on this year's ballot. Only this time it was initiated, promoted, and paid for by the marijuana industry. This summit is designed to help provide you with the impacts of marijuana from people who are familiar with it on a daily basis and in a variety of settings. Please understand that I am bringing you this forum as Ramey Johnson and not as Councilwoman Johnson. Although each presenter, frankly, could use 2 hours on their own, unfortunately, we can only allot 35 to 40 minutes for each speaker. I am reserving questions until the end, time permitting. Yesterday, we went over 15 minutes. We'll have to see how that goes today. You may submit your questions through the chat line. Today, my first guest is Matt Durkin, Chief Deputy DA with Jefferson and Gilpin counties for 25 years. You don't look that old, Matt. Matt will address the issues related to marijuana in our legal system. Matt.
Well, great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ramey Johnson, for putting this together and for hosting us here today. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Diane, for making all the tech stuff happen. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about something that has become very, very important here in Colorado, certainly Jefferson County and Lakewood. My name is Matthew Durkin. As Ramey had indicated, I'm currently a Chief Deputy District Attorney in the Jefferson and Gilpin County District Attorney's Office, where I have had the honor to prosecute and protect our home for nearly 25 years. And I was really in the ground floor of the marijuana discussion. I was a younger Deputy District Attorney, and I was assigned to the West Metro Drug Task Force in 2008. And if you recall, we'll go through this, if you recall, marijuana really started to explode in 2008. And so I do want to talk to you about that. I am a Chief Deputy District Attorney in the DA's office, but like Ramey, I am here today to talk to you as Matthew Durkin, who has experience as a prosecutor in the field, and I certainly don't represent the office of the District Attorney here this morning. So it's my honor and privilege to share with you my perspectives on marijuana, having closely worked in the field for what is now going on, 12 years now. So let me try to share the screen, if I can do that. Great. And I think we're off and running, are we? Okay. Well, great. Well, just a quick review of what marijuana has been in Colorado. As you know, in November 2000, the Colorado voters passed Amendment 20, which legalized medical marijuana. It created a medical marijuana. And if you recall, for 8 years, that was pretty docile, not a lot of activity there. And then in 2008, the industry, this is their words, not mine, when Obama was elected president of the United States, they felt that they had an opportunity to create an industry. And so for the next 2 years, if you recall, there were dispensaries that were informal that were sprouting up all over Colorado, forcing the legislature to address the issue, and they essentially legalized dispensaries in 2010. In that time, from 2008 to 2010, medical marijuana cards and medical marijuana dispensaries literally exploded across the Colorado, certainly the Denver metro area, causing an influx of work for the Colorado Department of Health and Environment, who were regulating that at the time. And so it quickly grew out of control. And so the legislature stepped in and created dispensaries in 2010. 2 years later, in 2012, Amendment 64 was passed. That legalized recreational marijuana in Colorado, and it passed by a pretty healthy vote. So what I want to go through with you here today is just all of the arguments for marijuana, or all the promises that marijuana has made to Coloradans, and see where we are. We have a good body of evidence now, 8 years later after 2012, after Amendment 64, and certainly 20 years after Amendment 20. So let's take a look and see the journey that we've been on and where we currently stand. So one of the biggest reasons that was given to Colorado voters was that marijuana would be a tax boom, that we could tax recreational marijuana, and that would solve a lot of the budget crises that we were having in the state. And so there is no doubt that there has been significant tax revenues. These stats and figures are slightly outdated. I'm not sure that they've been updated in 2020 due to COVID, but as recent as 2019, $6.5 billion of tax revenues have been generated by marijuana since 2014. So a significant amount of tax revenues have been generated. It remains a very slight portion of the budget, but as you look at these figures with billions and billions of dollars of tax revenues, look around to see how are our schools doing. Well, there was a promise that $40 million, the first $40 million of tax revenue would go to schools in Colorado. And yet we can constantly see additional budget crises in schools, additional requests for funding for schools. So clearly there's been a disconnect between that tax revenue and schools. The biggest discussion last year, one of the biggest discussions last year before COVID, was the state of our roads. Certainly none of this marijuana has gone to improve our roads. And we are facing huge budget shortfalls before COVID and certainly now. So the question becomes, where is that marijuana going, or that tax revenue going? The Centennial Institute took a deeper dive and took a look at where those tax revenues are going, or what the exact cost of marijuana is to us as a community and as a society. And what they found was that for every dollar raised, so for all those billions of dollars, for every dollar of those billions of dollars raised by marijuana taxes, the community actually spends $4.50 to mitigate the effects of legalization. And those mitigation, or those costs, are borne, as you can see here, a huge amount in productivity, no surprise there, health. And as you can see there's a significant amount of mitigation that goes to crime. And so there's a significant additional cost when you legalize marijuana to enforcing laws and taking care of the community from a crime perspective. And we'll unpack that in just a moment. And so what we see here is that the promise that marijuana was going to be a huge revenue producer, it's actually a revenue liability to the tune of $1 to $4.50. So it doesn't appear that marijuana has been that economic success that we were hoping for. And here's another breakdown in that Centennial Institute study of those costs. Well, I took a look at some other states that legalized it around the same time. Oregon, Washington, California in 2012 also legalized recreational marijuana at the time. Oregon has produced a very comprehensive study of the effects of marijuana in their state, and their study is very, very similar to the study that the Centennial Institute produced. And in fact, they have a significant diversion problem, which means that marijuana is being diverted illegally to users and out of the state, both in-state and out-of-state. But they also have a curious or a unique perspective on the environmental impact that marijuana has had on their community. To grow marijuana, it takes a liter or a gallon, a significant amount of water per plant every day. And so when you consider that there are hundreds, if not millions of plants being grown, that is a significant impact on water resources for Oregon, and dare say that we have some water problems here in Colorado. It's a little bit more sparse than up in Oregon. So there's a lot of interesting corollary or collateral effects of marijuana. Anecdotally speaking, power lines can't be laid quick enough, and so the expense and the environmental impact that those power lines have to provide power to grow facilities, which consume an extraordinary amount of power, from the lights to the water and all of the things that go along with harvesting hundreds, if not thousands, of plants in any one facility, is an extraordinary cost to the community. So we were told that back in the day that, well, if we legalize marijuana, what we're going to do is we're going to limit kind of the reach of government, that government, it was overreaching with marijuana, that we're getting too far into people's personal lives. And what we've seen since 2000 with Amendment 20, we've seen an expansion of government. And of course, government along with that is an expansion of budgets. So the Colorado Department of Health and Environment was tasked with monitoring the medical marijuana industry for several years. But with the advent of recreational marijuana and dispensaries, that created a whole new division, a medical marijuana or marijuana enforcement division with the Colorado Department of Revenue. Amendment 64 tasked the Department of Agriculture to monitor hemp and make sure hemp is not being abused. The Department of Education has had to produce additional resources to manage basically public information to children. As we legalize marijuana, we are also telling them to stop using or to not use it at all. We have additional resources that have been necessary for law enforcement. The Colorado Department of Public Safety, CBI, CSP, has had to dedicate additional resources to marijuana. The feds have not stopped investigating. Rather, we're going to see in a moment that they've actually had to do more investigations. And the city of Denver has actually created a six-figure position for a marijuana czar. And that is a position dedicated exclusively to answering questions about the medical and recreational industry because it is so convoluted and complicated that it's basically a hotline to answer questions on how to operate a business. So as you can see, government has expanded with marijuana. But how it's truly expanded is certainly in law enforcement. We were promised that if we just legalize it, then the police officers could focus on other things. And I can assure you that marijuana is at the heart of a lot of crime in Colorado. And in fact, it is responsible for, anecdotally speaking, in some jurisdictions, if it is not a domestic violence homicide, there are some marijuana connection to most, if not all, of those remaining murders in some jurisdictions around the state. What we see here is, again, this is a slightly outdated article, but it's an excellent representation of the cost and the resources that are dedicated to marijuana still. This is an article in which the Colorado Springs Police Department had indicated that search warrants related to marijuana, they had more search warrants related to marijuana than all other search warrants on all other crimes combined. So it is a significant resource drain for law enforcement. I can tell you that in Jefferson County, the West Metro Drug Task Force receives calls every day from citizens concerned about marijuana in their neighborhoods, whether that's a grow facility or some type of distribution that occurs even in my front yard here with a neighbor who goes past my front yard to deal in a park that is frequented by a lot of young families. He deals right there. So we have seen that marijuana networks have used Colorado to grow marijuana and then divert that marijuana nationally. And we had a massive investigation involving the DEA, I believe the Front Range Drug Task Force, and drug task forces all over the Front Range, where there was a syndicate that would buy or rent houses. And we are talking houses in very lucrative communities, houses that we would all want to live in. They would convert those houses to grow facilities, and there would simply be marijuana in those houses and maybe one or two employees of the syndicate who would grow the marijuana and then divert that marijuana out of state. We did search warrants on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of those houses all along the Front Range for literally years, taking out that syndicate. So the black market is still alive and well, which was, yet again, one of the promises made was that what we would do is we would take marijuana out of the black market and we would just push it into the light. And so what we have now is not just a recreational or medical industry that we need to regulate on the front end, out in the front door, but we now have a very robust black market, as you can see here. And in the middle, we have a gray market in which those licensees are also dealing out of the back door of their facilities. So it has really driven up a significant amount of work to understand exactly what's going on with marijuana in any individual operation or in an individual house. Marijuana is flushed throughout our community. This is a search that was done in a house not too far from where I live here in South Jeffco. Again, a beautiful home, a home that I think we would all kind of like to live in, as you can see some of these pictures here. These are your neighbors. This couple right here, I believe that they're in their younger 60s, and what they had done is they had dug out crawl space. We really are kind of mystified as to where all that dirt went, and they created a grow facility. And what's interesting is just not the amount of product, 675 plants, 38 kilos of basically product. That's the leafy substance that's sold. That's a significant amount. But also there is often polydrugs involved. And in this case, there was a half a kilo of mushrooms, which is a significant, probably the largest amount of mushrooms that I've seen in my career. So again, there is a significant amount of illegal marijuana, and it's getting more and more flush into our communities. So then the question becomes, we have marijuana in our communities. What is it doing to our communities? And if you follow Alex Berenson, he has been a very interesting person in this discussion. He's a journalist. He came at this and he really wanted to know more about it. But his own bias going in was that marijuana was not a big deal, and you know, why not just legalize it for all the reasons we've already discussed this morning. And what he found is that marijuana is really a destructive force in each of our communities, not just from a criminal perspective, but also a corollary perspective of mental health and addiction. And so what he has seen, and he did a study of marijuana throughout the country, and what he saw and unpacked was really terrifying. That marijuana is really a driving force in higher rates of violence and higher rates of crime and aggravated assaults. And so as you can see here in his study that was in the Imprimis article, Colorado, Washington, Alaska, and Oregon all legalized recreational marijuana about the same time and they all have seen increases in murders, aggravated assaults, and other types of crime. And that, I can assure you, is the case here in Colorado. Since 2012, our murders have increased 28%, violent crime 20%, and burglary is up 8% as recent as 2019. As we have seen in the newspapers recently, that crime is really off the charts this year in 2020. Along with that, what we are seeing is that marijuana is having a significant detrimental effect on individuals' mental health. And so more and more information as is being revealed as we basically understand marijuana better, and probably for the first time, we understand marijuana and its effects on the human mind. And what we're seeing is that it is linked to higher rates of psychosis and schizophrenia. So one of the promises that we were made, and this is back in 2020, it's in our Constitution here in Colorado, is that marijuana is medicine. But what we're seeing is that the side effects of this purported medicine is significantly
Diane, I have lost Matt.
Yeah, it must be Matt's internet connection. He'll probably rejoin us. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I'm sure it's because of the wet weather. And yeah, he has dropped off. I'm sure he'll rejoin us in just a second. Let's just wait for just a minute.
Okay. I'll tell you what, we'll give him a few minutes. And then we'll go to Joe McGuire and allow her to speak, and then Matt can come back.
Yeah, I haven't seen him come back in yet, but he will. He just texted me. He said, sorry about that. He's reconnecting right now.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
I know a lot of people are having internet difficulties because of the weather. Not to mention electrical. I know there's a lot of people that were without power.
Well, we were fortunate yesterday that all of us did. Okay.
There he is.
Matt, please unmute, Matt.
Are we back online?
Yes, thank you.
Right. Well, good. I'm so sorry about that. Let's continue to roll.
It happens.
All right. So to address whether or not this is medicine, as I was saying in Amendment 20, the Colorado voters expressed significant compassion for those who were suffering, and we didn't want them to suffer anymore. So it was promoted as a relief for cancer patients or those patients suffering from HIV. But what we saw in up to 2008, and then the explosion of medical marijuana cards after 2008, that it was rarely the person who was suffering from cancer or HIV that was the patient. It was mostly to the tune of 92% of those cards were young 30-something males who were suffering from severe pain or severe nausea. And of course, those things were always self-diagnosed. And so what we saw was what appeared to be kind of a manipulation of that goodwill. But as we understand marijuana more and more and more, we are seeing studies across the world that perhaps it doesn't really help the issues that we hoped it would. That there's an Australian study from 2018 that says it doesn't really mitigate pain, it can actually increase pain. A lot of folks have indicated that this is a good alternative to opiates, that we are also suffering from an opioid crisis here in the United States, and that perhaps marijuana is an alternative to those opiates. And what we are seeing is that those who engage in marijuana are 3 times more likely to engage in opiates or be addicted to opiates later on. as we've already indicated, we're seeing that mental health is a significant side effect from repeated use of marijuana. The concerns that we have for our teens, our youth, that the detrimental impact it's having on their mental health, that they are significantly more likely to develop schizophrenia or other mental health issues, is a study that we are seeing. And part of all of this is just, this isn't your grandfather's or your father's marijuana. The marijuana that is being produced right now has THC levels that are beyond kind of our comprehension or really understanding how that impacts the human body. I actually was at a conference at one point, and I was even skeptical. I mean, I asked the doctor at the conference, I said, is it really possible that marijuana has this radically psychological, or causes this radical event of psychosis? And what he said to me in response was, we simply don't know what these THC levels can do to the human body, because we've just never been able to understand that or study that before. So we are seeing some very significant negative impacts from a health perspective. And again, with that addiction rate in mental health, that really fuels crime, which is happening here in Colorado. We see that marijuana emergency room visits are on the rise, and they've been steadily on the rise ever since 2012. And we are seeing that there's certainly a health impact from just overdoses. We were told that no one can ever overdose from marijuana, yet here's what we're seeing is that they are routinely flooding our emergency rooms around the Denver metro area. As I indicated, use, no surprise, has increased since 2012. And what we see is the increase in use amongst youth is very, very concerning. We're one of the highest in the country. And we're talking about past marijuana use for ages as low as 12 has increased 58%, making us one of the highest rates of use for 12-year-olds. Just think of who is close to you and think of them as being 12. It's really unfathomable to see or to think that they are using drugs and what the impact will be on them later on in terms of their development, mental health, productivity, their future. No shock that adult marijuana use has increased. College age youth marijuana use has increased, and youth is, as I indicated, youth use has increased as well. As this was unfolding, I testified in the legislature several times in 2010 against dispensaries. And once dispensaries were legalized, I was part of the first committee that approved the first marijuana regulations in the United States. And through all those discussions, from a law enforcement perspective, advocates in the industry were very aggressive in the point that no one dies from marijuana. Well, we know that's not true. What we understand now in Colorado is vehicular fatalities related to marijuana doubled between 2013 and 2017, causing 115 deaths in 2017 rather, and that only slightly declined in 2018. These are deaths that are just tragically so avoidable and yet so destructive, both to the driver, the offender, because they obviously end up in prison, obviously the victims and the victim's family. We see that we have had folks come to Colorado with the dream of marijuana, and part and parcel with all the discussion we've had this morning with mental health, that they actually, in whatever capacity that they're in, turn around and kill once they get here. So we've had some homicides in Golden that are directly related to marijuana. We had a domestic violence homicide in Denver where the defendant, Kirk, killed his wife, he claimed, after he took some marijuana edibles. And then we have a tragic event from 2012 where there was a foreign exchange student from Africa. He actually was studying in Wyoming, came down to Denver to spend time with his friends, bought marijuana cookies. Now, marijuana cookies, the dose or the amount that you're supposed to eat is about the size of an Oreo, but those are actually 6 servings. So you're only supposed to eat a sixth of an Oreo. Now, I don't know about you, but I can probably put down a whole bag of Oreos in a matter of minutes, and yet we're asking people to only have a sixth of an Oreo, and that's what happened with Levi Ponji. He had a sixth of an Oreo. He didn't feel the effects. He had 2 more doses, didn't feel the effects. He ended up ingesting the entire cookie, just one cookie, and he had a psychotic episode that caused him to fling himself off of a balcony in a hotel by the old Stapleton Airport. So we see that there are tragic deaths, and what we've seen around the country is something we saw here in New York, where not just deaths related to marijuana and the use of that marijuana, but deaths surrounding the transactions to get that marijuana. And we see, I believe it was an NYU student, Tessa Majors, who left her dorm to go downstairs and to buy some marijuana from some individuals who then turned around and stabbed her and basically ripped her up. It's called a rip in the drug business. So where are we at? And what we have seen is that the promises that were made by marijuana, that it would be less government, it would be a tax revenue, that it's actually medicine and would help the individual, that it would lessen crime. All of those things have failed. And what we have seen is it's been quite a whip effect in the other direction, a slingshot effect in the other direction, causing greater damage to the communities, greater expense of resources to the communities. And from our perspective as prosecutors and law enforcement, greater crime and greater caseloads, which of course is detrimental to communities. So what have we learned? Well, we legalized medical marijuana in Amendment 20. We created dispensaries in 10-1284. We legalized recreational marijuana in Amendment 64. We had to reform the drug laws to minimize penalties for drugs and marijuana. We did that in 2013. And what we have seen is negative impacts in our community. But did we really learn those lessons? And the answer is sadly no, because in 2019, the legislature made possession of drugs a misdemeanor for any drugs below 4 grams. And so it seems as though we continue to make the same mistakes again and again. And so that has led studies to say we got to stop this process. We have to understand this data better and react to this data in a better way. And finally, this is one of the studies that says we need to rethink whether or not marijuana is proper for any community. And it's a lot of what we've already discussed, that it's dangerous because of high THC. There are side effects, both legal and social. It does not lower crime. Tax revenues are not increasing. Minority communities are disproportionately bearing the burdens of all of the issues that we've just discussed here this morning. It has not addressed the injustices that are claimed by the marijuana industry, that it was used by law enforcement to target people. We see more crime, we see more victims, and obviously we're seeing more law enforcement intervention. And certainly commercial cannabis will not regulate itself. That is that regulation out the front door and the gray industry that is quite lucrative out the back door. So studies have come in and really asked us to really think whether or not legalization of marijuana is appropriate. So that leads us to some other videos that are available in other communities. Please take a look at Seattle is Dying. It was released in 2019, and it kind of profiles from their perspective. This isn't just a Colorado problem. We've also seen that it's an Oregon problem, and here in Seattle, we've seen all the issues, and this is a great profile of the negative impacts of legalization of marijuana or legalization of drugs that it is having on communities around the country. So with that, I know that's a lot of information. I look forward to getting your questions and answering those questions. And again, thank you for the opportunity for me on a personal level to talk about the issues that marijuana has created in our community.
Thank you, Matt. The information that you just presented is profound. And once again, this is the kind of presentation that needs to be mandatory in our school districts and frankly, for all city councils as well. My next guest is Joe McGuire. Joe is director of the National Drug an alcohol screening association, and assists in keeping businesses drug-free. Diane, can you please help with the screen? We've still got Matt's slide up.
Let me,
He needs to stop sharing.
there we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Don't hear that often. Please stop sharing.
Okay.
There.
Diane, honest with all of this technology, frankly.
So are you seeing the main slide or the presenter view?
We've got the main slide.
the
Look good.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. A few things that I'm going to talk about overlay with Matt's presentation. So thanks, Matt, for setting me up just perfectly. I've been involved in workplace drug and alcohol testing for over 10 years. I started out doing that job in Colorado Springs, Colorado, after working for 10 years prior to that in drug and alcohol prevention, youth prevention, bullying prevention, that type of thing in schools. And what we saw, I was in the post Columbine program. I was the manager of Safe to Tell, which many of you have heard of and have seen in our schools. What we saw was precursors to violent crimes involved youth drug or alcohol use. Invariably, when you looked at the signs and symptoms and the warning signs and the precursors and what we were going around educating our schools and teachers about, was there was this nexus to substance use. And so eventually that led me into this field. And so I want to share with you some of the outcomes that we have seen based on for the workplace. But I want you to be thinking about, while we go through workplace, and you know, I always gear this to the business community, to the employers, but I also want you to remember that, you know, you as employees also have families. So this all has an impact on families, children, communities, etc. So let's just dive right in. Aside from impairment, which we all know exists, we all know that cannabis impairs. Some people will argue it, but it is just the plain truth. What other risks exist to the workplace besides the impaired employees? So let's just take a look at this real quick. You heard Matt talk about the association between the level of cannabis use and the risk of psychosis. And we have over 571 references in 18 studies, with studies of over 66,000, almost 67,000 individuals. So these are not just one or two pieces of information that we look at and hearken to. This is incontrovertible data that shows that higher levels of cannabis use are associated with increased risk for psychosis. So take that into the workplace. I work with an emergency room physician in Pueblo who tells me, you cannot believe the amount of mental health breakdowns we're having on a day-to-day basis in the ER from employees that this happened to at work because of their marijuana use, right? So we're not even thinking about how is the employer equipped to handle mental health issues in the workplace, aside from the workplace accidents and injuries, which we'll get to later. The first episode of psychosis due to high potency cannabis use is increased 5 times. And it depends on the amount of use. We used to say in the world of prevention, when I was in the prevention field, that chronic use for kids and youth and college students and adults was about 1 time a week. We considered that regular use by scientific standards. Weekly use, forget about it. That is so far in the past. We're not just looking at daily use now, we're looking at multiple times a day. So here we had daily use, it increases 5 times for psychotic use, but weekend nearly triples. And then high potency marijuana use alone is responsible for 24% of psychosis cases. We also have mood and anxiety disorders that we're dealing with in the workplace. So we're constantly trying to train employers on how to understand these issues and how to identify and recognize. And we've gone over into this whole world of, it's not just trying to identify the signs and symptoms of someone who's drinking too much on the job, or maybe they come into work smelling like a joint and you're trying to figure out, did they smoke in the parking lot, or was that from last night, or whatever. But now you're looking at this whole other world that is exacerbated with mental health issues and substance use and comorbidities and all of these things. So here you are. Think about this. You're an employer, right? A small business owner is typically who is the most impacted. And you know, America runs on the back of the small business owner. They are the oil and the wheels that make our economy go. And so you're taking someone who, you know, bakes the best cakes and opens a little corner bakery that we all love to go to. Or maybe it's your friend who owns an auto mechanic shop. And these are our neighbors and the people that are the fabric of our community. And now all of a sudden, this individual who started a business because they just do something really well, and they've put all of their life savings and lifeblood into having this business that that we all, you know, want to support. And now they're not just trying to figure out how to do that one thing well, like bake the cake or fix the car, but now because they've grown and they're having some success and they have employees, they're having to look at drug and alcohol policies and how to train on signs and symptoms of drug use and how to look at mood and anxiety disorders and how to look at psychosis and what does that mean. And I'm telling you, I hear from employers every single day that are overwhelmed, exhausted, and they just want to throw in the towel because they're sick of the people problems. And then when I start pointing out how the people problems have to do with the drug and alcohol use, the substance use, they're in shock because they're going, oh my gosh, everything that you're saying can be narrowed down to that one thing. They now have to become experts in substance use disorders, which is really sad and frustrating and cost them tons of money. And I'm gonna show you that. We also have marijuana use and risk of stroke. I'm not going to really dwell on this tremendously because I'm sure you'll hear much more of this from Dr. Ken Finn, who is directly following me. But I want you to put that in the context of workplace and look at the ages of these patients. 80% men, 64 stroke patients, average age 32. That's your workforce. That's your workforce. All right. And that's where I'm really concerned is that what are we doing to the working age? Those weren't strokes in your retirees. This was 32 years of age. People are in the prime and just getting their careers going. Also, you heard Matt talk about increased use of opioids. We have been promised that marijuana legalization will decrease our opioid use. And other states are pointing to Colorado, where we had a 1-year dip right after legalization. But then what has happened is we shot right back up. And not only have we shot back up in use, but our opioid deaths have increased 93%. So we have to make sure that we're getting the accurate statistics out, the most recent information, so that other states will stop thinking that we're the model of success for marijuana legalization, because we're actually a devastating, traumatic story of what this is doing in our communities. Now let's go to workplace. Over 600 employees surveyed, according to Westward, said 48% said, I've gone to work high in the past 30 days. Ha ha, wink, wink. Isn't this funny? We're getting away with it. And that was the tone of the Westward article, was, you know what, no big deal. We're norming this and everybody does it. So what's the big deal? Well, let me talk about what the big deal is on a few different levels. First of all, back in the 80s, when cannabis potencies, the THC potencies was 10% or less at the most, there was a study done on pilots in New Zealand, and this pilot study, these pilots became proficient on a flight simulator, and they all smoked a marijuana cigarette, low THC potency, and then they got back in the flight simulator in different time increments, and they crashed and they crashed and they crashed. 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 1 hour, whatever, right? And so then after these trials and all of that, they went back to the dorms and they slept overnight. And again, remember, low-grade THC, nothing like what we're dealing with now. This was old school weed, all right? 24 hours after having that one joint and then sleeping it off, they come back and they get in the flight simulator. Difficulty in aligning with and landing on the runway, increased vertical and lateral deviation from the required flight path, right? So you're seeing problems with approach on landing was twice the pre-marijuana test, significant increase in distance from the center of the runway. One pilot landed off the runway entirely. Here's the kicker. Look at the bottom bullet point that I'm showing you. The pilots were not aware of any impairment. They all said, I'm fine, it's worn off, I'm good, we're good to go. And you hear all the time, I use pot all the time and I'm not high because I build up a tolerance, or that, you know, it's not fair for you to drug test me and say what happened on Sunday afternoon because I come to work this morning and I'm high. And now we're looking at these massive, huge potency levels, telling you folks that this whole argument that I'm not high, I'm not stoned, it doesn't impact me, is absolutely not true. We have studies that show if you maintain just 1 nanogram of THC in the brain, that you show signs of inability to do multi-divided attention tasks and slow response times and whatnot. So all of this kind of lulling us into this sense of it's safe, it's okay, it's harmless, is just absolutely false. It's a false pretense, it's a false dichotomy. And we have to stop falling for those arguments and go back to what the science says and what actually is happening, so that we understand how to put safety first and protect our communities, our families, our children, and our workplaces. So what do we have in Colorado? We hear that with our data that we have, AAA has this report out repeatedly slamming Colorado for our lack of enforcement roadside. 57% of marijuana users admit to driving within 2 hours of use. And we've seen the percentage of traffic deaths and fatalities go up when a driver tests positive for marijuana. I heard a presentation for the state of Montana 2 days ago, because they are trying very desperately to legalize marijuana just like us. And they bragged about how great it's working in Colorado. And yeah, there's these studies on traffic fatalities, but nobody really knows if that was how much alcohol was in the system at the time of that death. You can't blame it on marijuana. And actually, that's not true. We show that traffic fatalities are when there is marijuana only in the system. We also show traffic fatalities when there was a combination. And we have this data, and it's incontrovertible. So what does that have to do with workplace? 1 in 5 marijuana users in Colorado report driving after marijuana. We'll take a look at this. The leading cause of death for workplace fatalities is driving impaired, distracted, and fatigued. There's national campaigns from the National Safety Council to try to decrease employees driving buzzed or stoned. And the #1 time frame for law enforcement in the United States to capture DUI or impaired driving is between 8 a.m. and noon. So one of my roles with National Drug and Alcohol Screening Association is to train breath alcohol test technicians who capture the breath alcohol test in the workplace with random tests or reasonable suspicion tests at the drug test facility during the day. They also do random drug testing. And I can tell you story after story after story when we get someone who's pulled for a random test or they're brought in for reasonable suspicion, 8 a.m., 9 a.m., 10 a.m. I had a guy at 7 o'clock in the morning who came in. He had just driven senior citizens to doctor's appointments. He picked them up at the senior citizen residential facility and drove them to doctor's appointments. And someone said, this driver isn't acting quite right, called the supervisor brought him to the drug test facility. By the time he got to me, it was about 7:45 in the morning. He tested 3 times the legal limit, right? And he had marijuana on board and he had opioids on board. So 8 a.m. to noon is when we have the #1 positive test for impaired drivers. You're telling me that you think that those aren't people driving our trucks on the highway? I know they are, because I get the reports all the time of there was a driver working for a national organization that you would all know, and a local person driving with them down the street up in northern Colorado looked over. The driver and his partner were both smoking weed, lighting up bongs in the truck on the road at the stoplight while they are working. So huge problem that we're having. And part of this is because we're not getting the message out about the dangers. We're telling people safe, no big deal, like a glass of wine, but you're not allowed to drink a glass of wine while you're driving down the road, and yet we're not having great enforcement or education on this issue. So let's take a look at what these outcomes are looking like in Colorado and nationally. The National Transportation Safety Board reports that a study of truck drivers from 182 heavy truck crashes in which the driver was fatally injured, a third of the drivers tested positive for illicit drugs. Marijuana and alcohol were found most frequently, 13% each, followed by cocaine, other stimulants and amphetamines that were less than. 41% of the alcohol and other drug positive drivers tested positive for multiple drugs, and impairment from alcohol and other drugs was determined to be a factor. One of the scariest things about this whole scenario right here is that heavy truck drivers know, according to U.S. Department of Transportation mandated drug testing laws, they are not supposed to be using any drugs or alcohol, and there are very strict fines, penalties. They could lose their licenses, their careers over this kind of thing, and yet we're creating an age by continuing to loosen the rules and legalize further and further and further that this is okay. And it's one of the things that we really need to consider is what are the messages we're sending. Again, past month illicit drug use among adults 18 to 64 employed full-time by industry category. Here you can see food services has a huge problem, arts and entertainment, management, the information industry, construction. Here we're getting into some of these other careers, but what we see is that drug use continues in our working age. 18 to 64 employed full-time. You have these high rates of drug use that continue on and on. We're not lessening it by legalization, we're actually increasing it. We also have a problem with those who are employed in the cannabis industry, working impaired and having increased accidents and injuries at work. A lot of the problem that we have with this situation, if you have these businesses in your community, is these folks are afraid to report to workers' comp for fear that they won't get covered. They don't realize that's a state program and not a federal program. So I have been in these facilities doing tours and talking with employers, and they've said, well, you know, we just have to pay out cash and we can't report these accidents and injuries, which I'll tell you hurts the employee. The employee doesn't get the care they need. They don't get the long-term, medical care that they Substance use does not equal safe. Substance abusers in the workplace are 5 times more likely to file a workers' compensation claim. Roughly 35% of accidents and injuries take place in the U.S. and significantly higher, and also higher for those who use marijuana. Operating machinery under the influence is a great risk. So you have employees that are defined as safety sensitive for U.S. Department of Transportation, which is your school bus drivers and your railroad engineers and truck drivers and airline pilots, et cetera. But we haven't done a good job of defining safety sensitive outside of DOT. So what about those operating machinery and in the aerospace industry and in mining? And mining takes place on private property, so sometimes we don't define those things. What about oil and gas? Those things aren't defined by the U.S., so they're not mandated to have necessarily drug and alcohol testing programs unless they self-regulate. Some do and some don't. Larger companies tend to, but small business owners tend not to, right? So they just keep accruing cost and cost and cost, and this really impacts the construction industry in a huge way. So if you want to attract industry to your community, but yet we are opening the floodgates for more employee drug use, then you're shooting yourself in the foot. Danger also increases when reflexes or judgment are compromised. Substance abusers are responsible for 40% of all industrial fatalities. I'm going to talk a little bit more about fatalities in a moment. Here's just some information that we have that we are seeing. Prosecutors said for a former Cook County Forest Preserve worker who was indicted on reckless homicide DUI charges in a fatal on-the-job crash. He had THC in his system. It drove the truck at 76 miles an hour into a line of 5 vehicles stopped at a red light. So we hear, well, it's safer for me to drive with marijuana in my system because it makes me a slower, better, more focused driver. You'll hear people who use pot say that all the time. They've actually argued that in court. And yet here you have someone going 76 miles an hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone and causing fatalities, especially not with the high potency products that we have. It can amp them up instead of slowing them down. Here's a CBS News report. Is your Waiterstone pot use highest among restaurant workers? Think about that. It also mentioned 6% of teachers and police, 10% of transportation workers. These are, we're going in the wrong direction, and I'm going to show you that more and more. Starting with Quest Diagnostics Drug Test Index says workforce drug positivity is at its highest rate in a decade in an analysis of more than 10 million drug test results. Colorado continues to be at the top of that list year over year over year. As a matter of fact, here in a couple of hours, I'm going to be listening to their most recent update for 2020. And I had a personal invitation to get the new Quest Diagnostics Drug Test Index results in a webinar at noon today, because Colorado is going to be mentioned repeatedly in the presentation, sadly enough. That's when I don't want to hear Colorado mentioned. But in the Quest Diagnostics Drug Test Index, when we legalized marijuana in 2012, when we voted on Amendment 64 for adult recreational use, our positive drug test results in the state for that year were at 8%, which was the national average. In 2013, year one, when personal use became legal, we shot up to 24% positivity, tripling our rates in the first year, and that was before retail stores even opened up. And we did not change our employers' rights to test in this law, in the state. Our laws are still strong. And yet, what did the employees hear? The employees heard, woohoo, right? So Quest Diagnostics says that the greatest increase in use of all illicit drugs by use employees in 12 years we are seeing based on lab results. So we're not decreasing illicit use by legalizing marijuana, we're increasing all drugs of abuse. Now look at this. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, drug and alcohol-related deaths in the workplace soared in 2016 with a spike of more than 30% in a single year. So if you're an employer listening to me, or a business owner, or you're in any of the major industries that have safety personnel, we're doing safety trainings, we're getting safety toolboxes, we're hooked up with the National Safety Council trying to teach people about safety and OSHA and all of this. But if we are not talking about drug and alcohol abuse, and specifically marijuana use, you are wasting your time, effort, energy, and money, because this is one of the primary causers. And we're not doing ourselves any good by continuing and continuing and continuing to go down this path. The Bureau of Labor Statistics also shows that fatal work injuries in 2016 were the highest since 2008. What are we doing? We are causing loss of life, and yet we're looking the other way for some money that, as you saw with Matt's presentation, is not rolling in. And also, how much money is worth the life? How much? Put a price tag on every one of those heads that have been lost in the workplace, and go tell their families that the tax revenue we're bringing in is worth it. I think they would disagree. Now, employers have this perspective still to this day that as long as they just don't hire stoners, they're going to be okay. But the problem that we're seeing is perception versus reality. We're normalizing this so much in our state that it's not uncommon for as you just saw on the slide I showed, that the school teachers. I mean, my sister is a school teacher, and she called me one day and she said, I'm extremely disappointed to see in our teacher chat rooms how many teachers are getting together on Thursday night for marijuana parties and then going to teach on Friday. That's from a school teacher, right? So what do we really want to be having? We're seeing mommy parties, soccer mom parties, for moms who drop their kids off at school and then go have smoke parties or edible parties during the daytime while kids are at school. And then, do you think when 2:30, 3 o'clock rolls around, they're all clear and sober to go pick those kids up from school? I've had parents call me and say, I saw a mom token up in the carpool lane. What am I supposed to do about it? Right? This is the world that we're creating. Also think about the fact that employee drug use costs U.S. employers upwards of $7,000 a month in lost revenue. $7,000 is the minimum. And this normally is a 90-minute, at the minimum 90-minute presentation. So I'm giving you a third of what I usually do. But normally what I do is I walk through how those dollars are lost. And I want to tell you it's significant, and I can account for it and tell you exactly where that money is going and how small business owners are losing it. And most of them are not even aware that it's going out the back door. I also want you to know that there's a huge subculture amongst employees of where to find a job that looks the other way on drugs and doesn't drug test. You can go and find chat rooms. Now, I captured this screenshot a few years ago during a live presentation that I was doing, and I just typed into Google, where can I find a job that is drug friendly in my community? I happen to be in Reno, Nevada. This Job 2 Careers popped up. Now, Job 2 Careers has since changed this because I've done this presentation internationally so much, I think they started getting a bad rap. So a lot of these conversations have now moved over to Reddit and different chat groups and on Twitter. But at this time, I found 337 no drug test jobs in Reno. You could click on them by industry. I had a guy sitting in the front row at a policy writing workshop, and he said, click on manufacturing, that's my industry. I clicked on it, his company was number 2. And the comments from the employees said, they're cool with it here, they don't mind if we use drugs, we're dealing drugs off the back dock and the management doesn't care. He was shocked. He said, I do care. And I said, do you have a drug testing program? And he said, well, no, I don't. That's why I'm here today. I said, okay, you're sending a message that you're cool with it. You don't care. And your employees have an entire subculture. There is a whole world on the internet that we don't know about of folks who are saying, you know, this place is good to use drugs. You can use them here. They don't care. Do what you want. Talking about smoking during lunch or in the break room or whatever, you know, edibles, whatever's going on. And employers are unaware and they don't realize that this culture exists. Now, I do have to say drug test programs work, and we see that workers who are not in a drug testing program have substance use rates that are 50% higher. The problem is that we see drug testing under attack, and in our state, we have people in our industry that drug test cheating is a whole entire sub-revenue of the marijuana industry. They sell fake urine right in the dispensaries. How to cheat the drug test is open conversation. I have a guy up in Wigan, Colorado, who also has a location at the airport. He catches about 30 people a week with fake urine trying to cheat the drug test. It's all THC positive. He has boxes of fake urine specimens. So we are having to train employers who are too intimidated to keep their drug policies in place, who are worried about a lawsuit, who throw their hands up because they're getting overrun. We have to now train them to detect and document signs and symptoms. It's almost what a drug recognition expert in our law enforcement has to do roadside. In fact, the guy in Wigan, Colorado that's in drug testing, he's a retired cop, and he's now doing training for employers on how to detect this. But the problem is that's another expense because we can't do those trainings for free. Some of them take all day. So now you have employers who have to train to actually become drug recognition experts. And we have to go through how to document and how to have these legally defensible so they'll stand up in court, something that an employer should never have to do. And one of the arguments I get on a regular basis, and it may be a question already pending in the chat box, is, well, when is an impairment test going to be ready so we can just test for impairment? We don't have to worry about all that stuff. And though you may hear that it's coming anytime and it'll be ready any minute and we're close, that's actually just not true. Because I'm in the drug and alcohol testing industry, I work with all of the labs and all of the toxicologists. My association is a membership association, so they are our members. I was on the phone with Quest Diagnostics yesterday, Psychomedics the day before, right? I want you to understand that I'm talking to the people who have the federal dollars to create these tests. And I work with them on a regular basis, and every one of them say, we're 10 years away from having a clear impairment test. What we are working on is a recent use test so we can tell if someone is used in the last few hours. Helpful, but still not impairment, okay? Why is that important? That's important because when you go to court, the lawyers try to say, well, this person isn't impaired, so you can't convict them, and the juries are buying that up. right? So when it comes to impairment, and they're saying it's 10 years away, and you may think, well, 10 years is worth waiting. Heads up, 10 years ago, they were telling me it was 10 years away. And I know that some of you heard me presenting this in 2012 and 2013 and 2014 and 2015, and I was saying 10 years then, and I'm telling you 10 years now, right? It's very frustrating that from when I said this in 2012, really what they were really saying is 18 years away, right? It's not getting any closer because this is an extremely complicated, complex issue. When you measure breath alcohol, you're measuring liters. You're measuring alcohol per liters of water in the body system. You can line the Pepsi liters up, or Coke, sorry, the soda bottles up on the floor to how many liters of fluid are in the human body. You can fill them up with so much alcohol, and that's exactly how much alcohol is a percentage is in the person's brain at that moment when you do a breath alcohol test. With cannabis, with THC, marijuana test, toxicologists say the measurement of this is like capturing eyedropperfuls in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. That's what we're up against to try to capture a measurable amount, much less create a standard for impairment with a wide variety of differentiation amongst users, which can be as different as 20 individuals all having a different response outcome. But then you put into play now more potent products. We're not getting closer to that 10% THC joint that was smoked by the pilots in the 80s. We're having variables of the edibles and the concentrates and now the distillates, and we're getting, is it 25% THC or 30 or 60 or 80 or 95? That's not helping us get to an impairment test. In fact, we're getting further away than closer to, and making it harder on the industry to come up with something that would help roadside. So applying that to the workplace is light years away. So we're not having any solutions for this. We're just trying to figure out how to deal with it as we go. I teach employers, plan, prepare, prevent, rewrite your workplace policies, get this training, actively engage in a progressive safety program, address mental health in the workplace, don't turn a blind eye to addiction. But again, if you think about the small business owner that you know, and now this is everything, they have to become a prevention specialist. They have to become an intervention specialist. They have to pay for programs to address these issues, and we are overburdening our workplace and our employers in a huge way. And when we teach signs and symptoms, now we're having to add in all of the additional signs and symptoms other than just being impaired, under the influence, a little stoned, look at the eyes, someone who has lack of motivation, maybe falling asleep on the job. Now we're adding this last bullet, neuropsychological decline, marijuana-induced psychotic symptoms. These are conversations that we have to have on a regular basis. And not only that, the cannabis industry has dictated to the workplace that you are now in a situation, if you want your case to hold up in court, when you're found to discriminate against somebody, that you fire because they came to work under the influence or were operating under the influence, or even using at work, because that's common. Now, if you don't have to find every single position description in your workplace by who may and may not be under the influence at work, your case isn't going to hold up in court. Can you believe that? I mean, when I started saying that to employees in 2013, after I served on Governor Hickenlooper's task force to develop the regulations for 64, I was on the Banking, Taxation, Civil Law Work Group to protect employers' rights. Was my mission to be there and address civil law, which was the drug testing law in the state of Colorado. What I heard the cannabis industry say was, you are irrelevant, you don't matter, you're going away, you can shut your mouth and don't say anything for the next year while we're doing this work, because you don't matter. Because this is their position. Some people should be, their are being placed on the employer. What we desperately need for workplace are good EAP, SAP programs so that we don't have to fire all the employees. We want to see them change behaviors. We want them to understand that you go to work responsibly, safe, and ready to work. But those are resources, those are costs. Those are things that are very difficult for employers to pay for and have in their budget, especially small business owners. Those are resources that are out of the scope. Do we care about people or don't we? Do we want moms and dads and brothers and sisters and aunties and uncles to come home to family members every day to be able to care for the children and then do their next job, their most important job of taking care of the family? Or are we going to allow this free-for-all to continue? And one of the things I feel very passionate about with my last 20 seconds is, in this country, we do have a Safe and Drug-Free Workplace Act that mandates that employers take care of vulnerable employees who could be injured by their coworkers who choose to do drugs. And yet we have largely ignored it and walked away from it and not taken care of those people that we have to protect. If you have more questions, my email is joe@joemcguire.org. That's joe@joemcguire.org, and I will stay for the Q&A, and thank you so much for hearing me out today.
Thank you, Joe. Your presentation was profound. Thank you.